The word plague conjures images of medieval Europe, black rats, cathedral bells, mass graves draped in fog. But strip that image away entirely, because the plagues of Jesus' time look nothing like what we have been taught to picture. They were quieter, older, and far more intimate than any Hollywood reimagining could suggest. What did it actually mean to live in a world where disease had no name, no cure, and no mercy? What happened to a family when sickness moved through a village in first-century Galilee, not as a medical event, but as a social, economic, and spiritual catastrophe all at once? And why did Jesus, of all the teachers of his era, spend more time touching the sick, the contaminated, and the dying than any other religious figure of his age? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels entirely. To grasp the reality of plague and epidemic disease in the world Jesus inhabited, you have to start not in a hospital, not in a temple, but in a house, a specific kind of house, in a Galilean village of the first century. A typical home was built from volcanic basalt stone, dark and heavy, its walls thick enough to keep out the summer heat, but never quite warm enough in the cold winter months. The floor was packed earth. The ceiling was made of wooden beams layered with reeds and mud, prone to collapse in heavy rain and perpetually damp. A single oil lamp might burn at night near the entrance. Smoke from the cooking fire drifted upward and found its way out through gaps in the roof, but never fast enough, leaving a permanent haze inside that irritated the eyes and lungs of everyone who lived there. And everyone lived there together. In these homes, multiple generations, grandparents, parents, children, sometimes livestock, shared the same interior space. Privacy was not a concept that had physical expression in this world. Proximity was the architecture of daily life. If you find value in recovering the world that shaped the words of Jesus, consider subscribing. This channel exists to rebuild that world, stone by stone, one video at a time. Water was carried by hand from a communal cistern or a nearby spring, stored in large clay jars that sat in the corner of the main room. That water was used for drinking, for cooking, for washing hands before meals. The ritual hand-washing that the Pharisees so carefully observed was not mere ceremony. It was, in practical terms, one of the only barriers between a household and waterborne sickness. The jars themselves were porous, and in summer the water inside could grow warm and stagnant within days. Now imagine that in this house, in this village, someone begins to cough, not a dry cough, a wet one, at night. There were no physicians in most Galilean villages. There were no pharmacies, no medicinal compounds of reliable efficacy, no understanding of contagion in the modern sense. What there was, instead, was experience. The accumulated, terrifying knowledge of what happened next. Experience, in the ancient world, was a brutal teacher. Villagers did not need a theory of germ transmission to know that when one person in a household fell ill with certain symptoms, others soon followed. They had watched it happen. Their grandparents had watched it happen. The pattern was older than memory, older than scripture, older than the village itself. The diseases that moved through first-century Galilee and Judea were not all the same, and the people who lived there knew the difference. Not by name, not by biology, but by symptom, by speed, and by outcome. Dysentery moved fast. A person could be working in the morning and dead by nightfall, the body stripped of every fluid it contained, leaving behind a hollowed, lightened corpse that shocked even those who had seen it before. Typhoid fever moved more slowly, building across days into a consuming heat that settled behind the eyes and in the bones, a fever so total that those who survived it often described the experience as having passed through fire. Tuberculosis, called by no single name in that world but recognized everywhere by its sound, was the long plague, the slow one, the one that moved into a household like an unwanted relative and refused to leave for months, sometimes years, consuming the lungs of its host gradually, stealing weight and color and voice before it finally took life itself. It was the disease that made neighbors lower their eyes when they passed a certain doorway. Everyone knew what the coughing meant. And then there was leprosy, or more accurately, the constellation of skin diseases that the Hebrew term tzarat described. Modern scholars debate exactly what conditions were included under that word. But in the lived reality of first-century Palestine, it did not matter precisely which skin condition a person had. What mattered was the verdict that followed the diagnosis. Because in the world Jesus walked through, leprosy was not merely a medical condition, it was a social execution. The Levitical codes, ancient, embedded, unquestioned, required that a person with suspicious skin lesions present themselves to a priest for examination. If the priest declared them unclean, everything changed. They could no longer live inside a town. They could not touch family members. They could not participate in the communal life that, in that world, was not a luxury, but the very mechanism of survival. They had to warn others of their approach. They had to announce their own contamination before anyone else could see it. Think about what that meant in practice. A father of 3, a man who owned a small plot of land, who had a wife whose children needed feeding. One morning he woke with a pale patch on his forearm. He showed it to the priest. And with a single word, the priest dismantled his entire life. He could no longer harvest his own field. He could no longer sleep in his own home. He could no longer hold his children. The land would be worked by others. The debt would accumulate, and the family he had spent his life building would learn to survive without him while he was still alive. This was the world in which the sick did not simply suffer physically. They suffered economically. They suffered socially. They suffered in ways that had no remedy, even if the disease itself eventually passed, because reintegration into community required another priestly examination, a ritual process, and the willingness of neighbors to accept someone back whom they had learned to live without. Disease in Jesus' world was never only about the body. It was always, simultaneously, about belonging. Belonging, in the ancient Near East, was not a sentiment. It was a structure. It had physical dimensions, legal weight, and economic consequences. To belong to a village meant that when your harvest failed, someone shared grain with you. It meant that when your roof collapsed after winter rains, men came with tools and stone. It meant that your children could marry, that your name carried credit at the market, that your voice counted in the disputes settled at the town gate. To be removed from that web, for any reason, including illness, was not social discomfort. It was something closer to slow erasure. And so when plague moved through a village, the fear it generated was never purely about death. Death was familiar in that world. Children died regularly before the age of 5. Women died in childbirth. Old men died of wounds that refused to close. Death was sewn into the fabric of ordinary life so completely that every family carried grief the way they carried water, constantly, without remarking on it. What plague added to that familiar grief was something worse than death. It added uncertainty. It added the terror of not knowing who would be next, not knowing whether the sick person in the corner of your house had crossed some invisible threshold that now made your entire household dangerous to the community around you. Villages had no formal quarantine systems, but they had social ones, unspoken rules, enforced by collective anxiety, determined how close neighbors stood when they spoke to a household with a sick member. Certain doorways stopped receiving visitors. Children were quietly redirected away from certain paths. The sick family did not need to be told they were being avoided. They could measure it in the silence between visits, in the way conversations at the well grew shorter, in the speed with which people found reasons to be elsewhere. This is the texture of the world through which Jesus moved when he encountered the sick. He was not walking through a neutral landscape dotted occasionally with human need. He was walking through a world saturated with fear, where illness carried social consequence so severe that many of the sick had already lost everything that made life livable long before they lost life itself. When Luke records that Jesus healed 10 men with leprosy on the road between Samaria and Galilee, the text is brief. The miracle is stated plainly, almost without drama. But if you understand the world surrounding those 10 men, the plainness of the text becomes devastating in its weight. Those 10 men were not simply sick. They were men who had been separated from their families, potentially for years. They had watched their children grow from a distance they were not permitted to cross. They had eaten food left at the edge of the road by relatives who could not stay. They had built their small, parallel community of the excluded because the excluded in that world found each other. They called out to Jesus from a distance, not because they were polite, because the law required them to maintain that distance from any healthy person. They were following the only rule that still applied to them, the rule that defined their separation. And Jesus sent them to the priests, not immediately healed, but instructed to go, to begin the process of reintegration before the physical evidence of healing had even appeared. They were healed on the way, which means they walked toward their old lives carrying nothing but a command and a hope before they had any proof that either was warranted. That detail is not incidental. In a world where disease destroyed belonging, Jesus restored belonging before he restored the body, restored belonging before restoring the body. That sequence matters more than it might first appear, because in the logic of the ancient world, the body and the community were not separate concerns that happened to overlap. They were the same concern, expressed in 2 different registers. A man whose skin had cleared, but who remained excluded from his village, was not healed in any sense that his world would recognize. Healing, in the fullest meaning available to that culture, meant return. It meant reintegration. It meant that the fabric torn by illness had been rewoven, and that the person stood once again inside the web of obligations, relationships, and daily rhythms that made human life sustainable. This is why the healings in the Gospels so consistently end not with the healed person lying quietly in gratitude, but with movement. Go show yourself to the priest. Return to your home. Go. Your faith has made you well. The destination was always re-entry. The miracle was always pointed outward, toward community, toward the restored possibility of a normal Tuesday morning. Drawing water, grinding grain, arguing with a neighbor about whose goat had eaten whose fig tree. Jesus operated in a world where epidemic disease was a permanent feature of the landscape, not a periodic interruption of normal life. In first-century Palestine, normal life already included the knowledge that sickness could arrive without warning and dismantle everything a family had built across generations. The Roman imperial system had concentrated land ownership, pushing small farmers into tenancy and debt. That economic pressure meant that families had almost no buffer against crisis. A single season of illness could force the sale of land that had been in a family for a century. Debt bondage was not a metaphor, it was a legal mechanism, and illness was one of its primary triggers. When Jesus healed in that world, he was not performing acts of charity in a vacuum. He was intervening in systems. He was short-circuiting mechanisms of exclusion and impoverishment that ran from the sick body outward through the family, the village, the economic network, and all the way to the temple establishment that administered the very priestly examinations that determined who was clean and who was not. The healing of a leper was not a private transaction between Jesus and one suffering man. It was a disruption of an entire chain of consequences, and perhaps this is what makes those encounters so difficult to read at full weight from a modern distance. We have separated sickness from economics, illness from social status, disease from belonging, We treat the body as a bounded individual unit that can be repaired in isolation from everything surrounding it. The world Jesus inhabited had not made that separation. In that world, when a plague moved through a village, it moved through everything simultaneously. Through the body, through the household, through the economy, through the social fabric, through the spiritual imagination of people who understood suffering as something that demanded interpretation. Jesus did not offer that interpretation from a distance. He did not theorize about suffering from the clean side of a ritual boundary. He crossed boundaries. He touched what was declared untouchable. He spoke to those whose voices had been socially silenced by their condition. He restored the ability to be present, to be physically, legally, communally present in a world that had ruled their presence impossible. The plagues of his time were not background detail. They were the stage on which the most radical claims of his ministry were performed. And once you see that stage clearly, once you understand what illness actually cost in that world and what healing actually restored, you do not read those stories the same way again. You read them as what they always were. Not supernatural interruptions of ordinary life, but the most concrete imaginable confrontation with everything that strips human beings of dignity, belonging, and the simple possibility of an ordinary day.